What's going on? In this video, I'm going over my entire step-by-step installation of the Cobb intake system in my 2017 WRX with a CVT transmission. Now the install is the same whether you have the CVT transmission or the 6-speed manual. First, I'll show you some clips so you can get a sense of what it sounds like. Then I'll offer you my thoughts and review, and finally you will see my entire installation. Let's get to it. So there you go, that's exactly what the intake sounds like now. If I was to have you listen to it without telling you what it was, you'd probably say that it sounds like air rushing through a hollow metal tube. And that's because, well, that's exactly what it is. This sound is not appealing to everyone. So the stock intake has measures to basically mitigate and control that sound. The upgraded intake, for instance, doesn't have a resonator. The resonator's purpose can vary based on car design, but one important function of it is to dampen the sound of air rushing through the intake on its way to the turbo. Now, I'm working on a detailed video going over intake systems, so I'm just going to leave that there for now. My car is only stage 1, and at this stage, the intake is basically just a noisemaker. Let's be realistic. The WRX already pulls air from the outside, so the temperature of the air coming in to the engine is not going to change much. Also, the stock intake is designed pretty well with little restriction. So besides the weight of the intake itself and the more streamlined internal path of the upgraded tube, the differences are trivial, and that's why you probably shouldn't expect much difference in power. Personally, I can't feel any difference at all either way. Now, in some cars and some cold air intake designs, you might actually trade some low-end torque for high-end horsepower, and that might actually be of some benefit to WRXs with a CVT transmission. I suspect if there's any gains to be had, they're going to be at higher RPMs, and for daily driving, we just don't spend a lot of time there. Once other bottlenecks get upgraded, like the downpipe, the intake is going to be a more worthwhile investment for power. Before then, it looks cool and makes an awesome sound for some, because not everybody's gonna like it, and it's especially nice when you have an upgraded exhaust like I do, because the car sounds like a beast under acceleration. The final thing I'll say before moving on to the actual install is that a tune is critical. For the time being, I'm using the off-the-shelf map for this intake, but you have to remember that off-the-shelf maps are made for a car model, not a specific car. So in order to make the maps good for the most cars, they're usually on the conservative side. It's important to get a Pro Tune to reap the most benefit and ensure your parts play well with each other, all parts, not just the intake, and that your car does not run lean. That said, let me show you how to install this intake. So we're going to start by removing the MAF sensor with a Phillips screwdriver. After you remove the screws, you got to disconnect the MAF sensor from the air intake and pull it out. The MAF airflow sensor is a critical and sensitive part of the intake, and it reads the amount of air entering the engine, and then it sends that information to the ECU. We're going to take that sensor and install it in the new intake tube. Now, it's keyed, so you can't install it backwards. Just line up the screw holes, and once in place, use an Allen wrench to secure the provided Allen screws. Make sure you save your original MAF screws in case you need to bring your car back to stock in the future. Once you're done, you can set it aside. We're going to be reusing this air scoop, but we need to remove it until the end of the install. It's only secured by 2 retaining clips, so use a flathead screwdriver to help you remove them, and then set them aside for later use. This intake scoop forces fresh air into a single point in the filter air box. Using a 10mm socket and ratchet wrench, we're going to remove the 2 screws that secure the airbox in place. Once that's done, we can unclip the box, separate the 2 halves, and very carefully wiggle the front part of the airbox out. The back part of the box is going to remain attached to the intake tube with a hose clamp, so we're going to use an 8mm socket and wrench to get it out. Make sure you loosen the hose clamp enough, otherwise it might be unnecessarily difficult to get out. Now we remove this under tray you see here. It's held in place by 13 retaining clips. There's 3 on each side and 7 on the bottom, and also by 2 12mm bolts. Once you get under the car, it's pretty easy to tell which clips hold the under tray in place. If you have a clip removal tool like this one, this will be much easier. Just be sure to remember where the clips came from, because there's 2 types, and we're gonna have to put this tray back when we're done. This tray shields engine components and belts from road debris and liquids. So let's stop for a second and appreciate this very efficient stock intake. After the air gets scooped and filtered, it gets read by the mass airflow sensor as it makes its way down this intake tube here to be delivered directly into the turbo inlet underneath the car. The bracket you see here is going to be used to secure the new airbox, but depending on which intake you have, you might not need to temporarily remove it. I bought my intake used and got the intake you see here on the right, which is now discontinued. As far as I can see, the intakes are the same except for the way in which the intake tube is secured. The old intake used a bracket which secured the tube at the MAF connector, which you're going to see that in a minute, while the new one uses this new mounting bracket which prevents unnecessary vibrations closer to the filter. That bracket attaches to here, and that's why you temporarily remove it if you have the new Cobb filter. Besides that change, the rest of the install is basically the same. So if you need to, use a 10mm socket and wrench to remove that bracket and set it aside. Then we're going to use the same socket and wrench with an extension to remove the nut securing the stock tube to the car. You should be able to easily reach it from the top like I do here. And the final thing securing the stock tube to the car is this hose clamp at the turbo inlet. Use an 8mm socket to loosen the hose clamp so you can slide out the tube. You might have to wiggle it a bit, but it'll come out. The rest of the install will be much easier if we remove the passenger side tray you see here. It's held in place by these 2 retaining clips and by 1 10mm bolt. So use your clip remover tool to easily get those out, and then use a 10mm socket and wrench for the bolt. After you remove those, you can lower the tray a bit for easy access, but it can remain in place. With that tray lowered, we should be able to easily slide the stock intake tube right out. Make sure you keep it and all associated parts together in your stock parts bin. With that done, we can stop for a second to appreciate the turbo that hides down here underneath the car. This is also a good time to inspect your hoses and check for leaks, since all of this is covered by the under tray we removed a minute ago. As you see here, we're going to attach the elbow to the new intake tube. Make sure you push it enough and loosely insert the 2 hose clamps so that we can make adjustments if necessary once we install it in the car. We'll get back to them shortly. Then we're going to take the new intake tube and carefully insert it from the top, just like you see here. From under the car, we're going to insert the elbow into the turbo inlet. It might require a little maneuvering to get it just right. We also have to be mindful of the notch that the stock intake utilized. The Cobb intake doesn't use it, and we have to make sure we don't insert the tube over it and possibly cause a leak. Once it's roughly there, loosely tighten the 2 hose clamps where they're going to go with an 8mm socket. Again, we'll get back to it for a final adjustment in a minute. So this next part is only for those of you who are installing the discontinued intake I mentioned earlier. We have to first attach this isolator to the chassis of the car in this spot right here. Once you insert it there, you can reach from behind to insert the securing nut and use a 10mm wrench to fully tighten it. Now we can take the bracket and put it on the isolator as shown here. You can then loosely insert the serrated nut. We'll give it a final adjustment once all of the Allen bolts are in place. For each of the Allen bolts that will secure this bracket, insert a lock washer and then align the holes on the intake pipe. Finger tighten the bolts and then finally fully tighten it with an Allen wrench. Once those two are done, you can fully tighten the serrated nut holding the bracket in place. This isolator here will dampen some of the vibrations to the intake tube and it'll prevent unnecessary and excessive play. Now we're going to take the MAF sensor extension and plug it in. You have to decide how you want to route this extension. If it reaches, you might want to route it behind the tube. Wherever you put it, be sure it won't rub against any sharp metal parts such as the bottom of the intake box. As you can see here, I went ahead and used zip ties to secure the extension to an existing cable to clean up the install a bit and prevent unnecessary rattles. It also tucks the cable away from sharp edges and prevents future movements. If you have the new intake shown here, this would be the point you would install this bracket back, along with a new intake retaining bracket before proceeding to the next step. Before installing the filter, measure 1 inch from the end of the tube and mark it with a pencil or a Sharpie. Don't guess at this, make sure you are precise. To help me, I temporarily put a zip tie here as a visual reference to make sure I don't go past that 1 inch mark. To be safe, I measured twice. Then you can insert the filter to that exact 1 inch mark. This is important as the tune you're going to be installing was designed with the filter installed to that exact point. Installing it otherwise can throw off the reading and cause issues to your engine down the road. Of course, we'll secure the filter with an 8mm socket and wrench. I bought my intake used, so this next part was already done for me. You have to take the included edge trim and install it as you see here. The thick one will go on the bottom. These will prevent rattles and chafing and ensure a tighter fit of the intake scoop. Take your time cutting these and always remember to measure twice and cut once. With the trim in place, we can carefully maneuver the airbox into its location, being mindful of all the cables and electronics in the vicinity. Since I have the old intake and I didn't need to remove this bracket, I'm going to put it back at this point because we will need it for securing the airbox. These are the 3 locations where we'll be securing the airbox. You should use the included hardware and only loosely tighten the bolts at first. Always start the bolts by hand first, and once they are properly threading, then you can fully tighten them. This is a best practice tip that will save you a lot of strip bolts in the future. Once they are all in place and the box looks good, go ahead and tighten them all. When you do this way, you can always make minor adjustments if necessary and prevent fitment issues with other components, such as the lid we'll be installing in a minute. Now we're gonna get back down to the turbo and fully tighten those two hose clamps with an 8mm socket. Give it a good inspection and make sure the elbow doesn't go over that notch. Make sure to orient the screws on the hose clamps for easy access. It might be easier to do this with an extension, as you see here. Once that's complete, we'll be done under the car. Make sure you put back the two under trays we removed earlier. Those provide vital engine protections and must be reinstalled. Back up top, we're going to reinstall the air scoop as you see here, securing it back in place with the two retaining clips. The airbox lid is secured in place by the 5 included hex screws with black nylon washers. First, make sure to finger tighten them, and then, once they're all in place, fully tighten them with an Allen wrench. Be careful here not to over tighten them and strip the Allen head. Remember, you're going to need to periodically remove this lid, service the filter, so you want to keep those screws in good condition. This is undoubtedly one of the most important parts of this whole installation. The parameters of the new intake are different than the stock setup. Even the MAF sensor is placed in a different location. We have to account for these differences to maintain the proper air-to-fuel ratios. Resist the temptation to run your car with an intake that requires a tune without the tune. You won't always be able to tell your car is running lean, and you can create the conditions that will eventually lead to catastrophic engine failure. The off-the-shelf map included with the Cobb access port is a good start, but it should be a temporary measure until a proper Pro Tune can be done. Once you flash your ECU, you are free to enjoy your car with your new intake. Thanks so much for watching. If this was useful, be sure to hit that like button and consider subscribing for more automotive tutorials, mods, and reviews. Take care.